The first time I truly felt the weight of this story was when I learned that Princess Anne herself had confirmed it. Not through a loud announcement or a dramatic press conference, but in a quiet private briefing meant only for senior palace officials. The news was simple and devastating. Meghan Markle had been formally erased from key royal records, and the part that made this genuinely shocking wasn't just that it happened. It was that William signed off on it, and Harry apparently had no idea it was coming until after the order was already prepared. That's not a family argument spilling into public view. That's the palace machine moving quietly, efficiently, and without looking back, while the person most affected by the decision was kept completely in the dark. Honestly, once you understand what actually triggered this, the timeline, the altered document, the private ceremony where everything collapsed, the whole situation stops looking like royal drama and starts looking like an institution deciding it was done negotiating with the past. This wasn't about one bad week or one angry phone call. This was about something much deeper, something that had been building for years. Let's start with what Anne actually confirmed, because the way this came out matters almost as much as what was said. This wasn't a public statement or a palace briefing meant for cameras. It happened during a recorded private briefing prepared for senior household officials. The kind of meeting where the language is precise and the people in the room understand that every word carries weight. Anne didn't dress the decision in soft palace language. She didn't reach for the kind of careful phrasing that lets everyone walk away pretending nothing really changed. She confirmed that Meghan had been erased from selected royal household records connected to working royal duties, ceremonial privileges, internal palace briefings, and future family protocol references. Now, working royal duties means the official jobs carried out by family members on behalf of the crown. The public engagements, the charity patronages, the diplomatic appearances, all of it. Ceremonial privileges means the formal honors, appearances, and access linked to that role. The things you get to do because you're an active working royal, not just someone who used to be one. And the Windsor Operational Archive, which is the palace system that tracks active duties, permissions, and future planning, no longer carried Meghan as a current royal figure inside those files. She's still in the historical record. What she did as a working royal is still documented. But the active operational mentions, the references staff use when planning duties, briefings, ceremonies, and access for the future, those are gone. That's the line. And it's a sharper one than I think most people expected. William had authorized what's being called a closing order, and the prince understood exactly what that meant. A closing order is the final instruction that ends an active royal reference inside palace records. Once it's approved, staff can no longer treat that name as part of future royal planning. It's not a pause, it's not a cooling-off period, it's not a wait and see, it's an ending. And according to the accounts coming out of Windsor, William received the sign-off file in silence. He didn't ask for the decision to be softened. He didn't look away. But behind that stillness, there was apparently a deeper wound because William knew this wouldn't only remove Meghan from documents. It would cut even deeper into the already broken bond between him and Harry. That's the part that's easy to miss if you're only looking at this as a bureaucratic story. Every signature on every page was also a decision about a brother. So here's where the imagery gets almost cinematic, and I'm going to walk through it because it tells you something about how seriously everyone in that room understood the moment. A senior aide stepped forward and placed a sealed folder before Anne. The room seemed to tighten around that small movement. She opened it carefully, and for one brief moment her expression changed. There it was. Meghan's name crossed from the Royal Access Index, which is the internal list used to decide who may receive certain palace briefings, ceremonial notices, and household permissions. Anne stared at the mark longer than anyone expected. She had seen duty demand painful things before, but this was different. This wasn't a distant constitutional question. This was family pain being turned into official record. And the most shocking truth, the thing that still isn't being discussed enough, is that the order had been prepared for weeks before the public ever heard a whisper of it. William knew, Anne knew, a tight circle inside the palace knew. Harry did not, so by the time Anne finally closed the folder, she wasn't speaking like someone relieved. She was speaking like someone bracing for impact. Her question cut through the silence. Had Harry been told yet? And that question right there tells you everything about the emotional reality behind the procedural language. Behind every royal order, there's a human cost. Anne wasn't just confirming a bureaucratic change. William wasn't just signing a palace file. Charles wasn't just watching another fracture form inside his family. And Meghan, absent from the room, yet present in every whispered pause, became the name everyone avoided, while the machinery of monarchy moved without mercy. Anne carried that room because everyone knew she'd earned that authority the hard way. She'd never been the loudest voice in any royal conversation, but she'd often been the clearest one. Inside Windsor, royal order means the strict system of rules, duties, access, and public roles that keeps the family from becoming chaos. That's why her words mattered so much here. If Anne said the line had been crossed, then the line was no longer up for debate. She'd become the person trusted to say what Charles could barely face and what William had finally accepted. And William sat with the burden of future kingship pressing heavily on him. Future kingship means more than wearing a crown one day. It means protecting the monarchy before the crown ever touches your head. The prince knew this decision wasn't only about records. It was about whether the palace could survive endless emotional pressure without losing its own shape. He wanted peace with Harry. Genuinely wanted it, but peace had begun to demand silence, compromise, and delay. And this time, delay felt dangerous. Charles read the confirmation notes slowly. The king lowered his glasses, looked across the room at William, and said only, "Are you certain?" The prince didn't answer at first. Catherine noticed his hand tightened against the edge of the table, and she understood the pain beneath his control. He wasn't acting out of coldness. He was choosing finality because every softer choice had failed. Then William nodded once, and that small movement seemed to strike the room harder than any speech could have. Harry wasn't there, but his absence felt like an open wound. Every mention of Meghan led back to him, back to the brother who'd stepped away, fought back, and still remained tied to every painful decision the palace had to make. Charles set the note down without speaking, and the monarch looked less like a ruler than a father, watching the distance between his sons become official. Camilla broke the silence first. The queen consort asked whether the language could still be softened, whether there was room for a quieter version that wouldn't feel so brutal. Anne didn't look away from her. She answered with a calm that made the truth even heavier. The process had already passed the point where kindness could change the outcome. Catherine looked from Anne to William, then back to Charles. She saw the king's regret, the prince's resolve, and the princess royal's iron discipline. No one in that room looked victorious. No one looked relieved. They looked like people trapped inside a decision they all knew had been coming. And still, one question remained sharper than all the rest. What private moment had pushed the family from tension into erasure? Because every palace rupture has a hidden beginning. For this one, it wasn't a headline, it wasn't an interview, and it wasn't a public accusation. It was a private ceremony at Windsor where a single protocol breach shattered what little trust remained. After that day, Anne stopped defending delay. William stopped seeking compromise, and Meghan's place in royal records began to look less like history and more like an unresolved threat. Anne had arrived that morning prepared to honor continuity, not conflict. The private Windsor commemorative ceremony was meant to be a quiet royal service, a formal family event used to remember duty, loyalty, and the long chain of service behind the crown. A ceremonial family register is the official list used to mark which royal figures are connected to a specific occasion. That's why the demand struck so hard. Meghan's representatives wanted her name restored to that register despite her non-working status, meaning she no longer carried out official duties for the monarchy. She wasn't going to be there. She wasn't performing any role, but someone wanted her name on the list anyway. William learned of the demand only minutes before Anne was due to lead the family into the service. The prince felt anger rise, not because a name had been mentioned, but because the timing felt designed to corner the palace when emotion was already high. He saw the move as pressure dressed as sentiment. If the family accepted it, the records would blur and the line between working and non-working royals would get fuzzier. If they refused it, the ceremony itself would become another battlefield. Either way, Meghan's absence had suddenly become the center of a sacred royal moment. That's the kind of impossible position the palace keeps finding itself in, where saying no creates a public story and saying yes creates a structural problem. Anne felt the insult with a cold, controlled force. She didn't object because of pride alone. She objected because the ceremony honored service, and service still meant something inside Windsor. To place Meghan beside active royal representatives would not simply soften old wounds. It would rewrite the meaning of duty in front of those who'd never walked away from it. And knew that if the palace allowed one exception under pressure, more exceptions would follow, and William knew she was right. A palace secretary later discovered the detail that changed everything. A draft registry page had been altered, and Meghan's title had been inserted beside names reserved for active royal representatives. A draft registry page is an unfinished version of the official ceremony list used before final approval. It's not the version that's supposed to go out. It's the working document, the one that gets reviewed and corrected before anyone signs off. The secretary showed it to Anne through a documented internal account, and the Princess Royal understood at once that this was no longer a misunderstanding. Someone had tried to place Meghan back into a role the palace had not granted. That's not an oversight, that's not a clerical error, that's an insertion. Anne stood outside the ceremony room holding the altered registry page between two fingers. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. William looked at the page, then at her face, and the prince saw the decision forming before she spoke. "This cannot happen again," she said. Those 5 words became the point of no return. William carried that sentence with him long after the ceremony ended. and kept the altered page in a sealed envelope, not as revenge but as proof. The envelope became the silent witness to a breach no one could explain away. And when it later resurfaced inside Kensington, the confrontation everyone had avoided finally arrived. The confrontation didn't erupt in public. It happened behind closed doors where the family could no longer hide behind titles, aids, or careful statements. William entered with the sealed envelope. Anne waited with the stillness of a judge. Charles sat between duty and grief. And Harry, hearing what had been prepared, realized that Meghan's royal standing was no longer being debated. It was being removed. William called the private meeting because the altered registry page could no longer remain buried. A private meeting means a closed family discussion with no public audience, no cameras, and no palace statement shaping the mood afterward. The prince knew the danger was bigger than one page. If records could be pressured, changed, or softened to protect feelings, then royal order itself would begin to weaken. Anne understood that too. She sat opposite Harry, calm and unflinching, because she believed the accuracy of royal records was now at stake. Harry looked at the envelope as if it were an accusation before anyone had even opened it. He demanded to know why William had brought him there like a defendant. The prince kept his voice low, but the restraint made the moment sharper. He told Harry that the monarchy could not preserve a role Meghan no longer held. It could remember her past, but it could not keep her active inside future planning. Harry's face tightened, and his disbelief turned quickly into anger. To him, this felt like punishment. To William, it was protection. Anne reached for the sealed envelope and slid the altered registry page across the table. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She said the page was the moment trust collapsed, and the words cut through the room with brutal clarity. The altered registry page mattered because it placed Meghan beside active royal representatives, people still carrying out duties for the crown. That wasn't a harmless mistake. It changed meaning. It changed status. And it forced the family to choose between emotional comfort and official truth. Charles watched Harry more than he watched the document. The king's grief was quiet, but it was everywhere. He asked one simple question, whether Meghan had authorized the demand. Harry did not answer. That silence became heavier than denial, heavier than anger, heavier than any defense he might have offered. William saw it, and Charles lowered his eyes. Because in that pause, the father inside him understood what the monarch could not ignore. Harry pushed his chair back so sharply it scraped against the floor. William didn't move and watched the empty chair after Harry left. Charles sat frozen, wounded by the sound of another door closing inside his family. The prince remained seated, staring at the page that had dragged all of them to this point, and then finally turned to him and said, "Now you understand why delay is danger." William heard the sentence and knew the next step would change everything. Anger had brought them to the edge, but anger couldn't finish it. The final order needed authority. It needed a signature. It needed someone inside Windsor strong enough to turn a painful family break into a permanent royal decision. And power quietly and unmistakably had already begun to move toward the future king. Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself with noise. It appears in signatures, sealed instructions, restricted access, and a single name placed at the bottom of a page. William had spent years learning restraint, but this time restraint was no longer enough. With Anne beside him and Charles watching from a painful distance, the future king used authority not as a weapon but as a boundary. William understood the power he now carried, and that knowledge didn't comfort him. His authority came through future household planning, the private system that decides how the royal family will work in the years ahead. It also came through internal protocol approval, meaning the right to approve rules about access, duties, records, and ceremony before they become fixed inside the palace. The prince knew this was why the decision mattered. It wasn't only about Meghan. It was about whether the next reign would begin with order or confusion. Anne stood beside him because she believed the same thing with absolute force. The Princess Royal had watched former roles remain half alive in palace language for too long, and she knew blurred records could become blurred power. If Meghan's name stayed active in official working records, then staff could keep treating old status as present authority. That was the danger. Anne didn't want revenge. She wanted a clean line. The family could remember the past, but it couldn't keep giving the past the key to the future. Charles felt the ache of it more deeply than anyone in the room wanted to admit. The king saw not just a document, but two sons standing on opposite sides of a wound that had never healed. He didn't stop William, and that silence said everything. The monarch knew Harry would see the decision as betrayal. He knew Meghan would see it as humiliation. But he also knew the palace couldn't keep bending its records around family pain without weakening the crown itself. A senior archivist stepped forward with the final breakdown. The archivist is the official keeper of palace records, the person responsible for making sure names, duties, and permissions are filed correctly. 3 categories were marked for removal: ceremonial access, active patronage references, and confidential household briefings. Ceremonial access means permission connected to formal royal occasions, the invitations, the placement, the recognition at events. Active patronage references means links to charities or causes supported by working royals, the official associations that come with the role. Confidential household briefings means private updates shared only with those still inside the royal machine, the information flow that keeps working royals informed about palace operations. Anne refused to let the language be softened. She looked at the wording, then at William, and made it clear that compromise would only create another battle later. The Princess Royal wanted the record to show a clean break, not a polite fog. William heard her, but the prince still struggled. He knew Harry would feel cut out. He knew his brother would believe this was personal, and perhaps that was the cruelest part, because the future king knew it was personal and necessary at the same time. That's a brutal place to stand, where doing the right thing for the institution means hurting someone you love, and neither part of that equation cancels out the other. William signed the order. The room held its breath. He placed the pen down after signing and didn't celebrate. He pressed his fingers against the paper for a moment, as though feeling the weight of what he just made permanent. Charles watched him with quiet sorrow. Anne watched him with iron approval, and once the ink settled, the palace didn't roar. It moved quietly, efficiently, and without looking back. The first fallout wasn't a public statement. It was a sequence of small removals that felt more brutal because they were so quiet. A name disappeared from an access sheet. A briefing line was deleted. A ceremonial reference was closed. And somewhere far from the room where the order had been signed, Meghan learned that the palace hadn't merely rejected her return. It had rewritten her absence into permanence. Palace staff moved with careful speed after William's signature. Internal archives were updated first. Those archives are the palace's private record system where duties, permissions, past roles, and future planning notes are stored. Then access protocols were changed, meaning the rules that decide who receives private royal information, invitations, and household updates. Future ceremonial planning files followed, the working papers used to prepare formal events before the public ever hears about them. The order mattered because it didn't attack the past. It removed active power from the future. Meghan's previous working royal references weren't destroyed. They remained in historical context, meaning she still exists in records of what already happened, but the active operational mentions were removed, and that was the line that cut deepest. Active operational mentions are current references used by staff when planning duties, briefings, ceremonies, and access. Meghan could be remembered as part of royal history, but she could no longer appear as someone the palace was preparing to include. That difference is small on paper and devastating in meaning. Meghan received the news through a private call from a former household contact who'd seen the updated file trail. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask for the words to be repeated. When the call ended, she kept the phone in her hand long after the line went dead. Harry watched her face change, and for once, neither of them spoke. Then she asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment, whether he had known before she did. Harry felt the humiliation land in stages. First came shock, then came anger, then came the colder realization that William and Anne had moved without asking him, without warning him, and without leaving him a path to stop it. The Duke saw the decision as more than paperwork. He saw it as a family verdict. Meghan looked at him for an answer, but Harry had none that could protect either of them from what had just become real. One aide inside the palace discovered another detail that made the fallout even sharper. Several future invitations had already been drafted without Meghan's name before the confirmation became public. Future invitations are the early lists prepared for upcoming royal events, and leaving her name out meant the palace had already begun acting as if the decision was settled. The removal hadn't started with the announcement. The announcement had only exposed what the machine had quietly accepted. Camilla privately warned Charles that the move could trigger a fresh war of statements. The Queen Consort feared Meghan and Harry might answer with fury, and she knew the palace would be forced into another painful cycle of response and restraint. The king listened, tired and solemn, then said the family could not live under threat forever. Charles wasn't celebrating William's choice. He was accepting that endless fear had become its own kind of prison. William felt the first consequences before anyone said them aloud. Staff began carrying out his order. Anne's warning had become policy, and Harry's silence had become distance. Yet the most revealing moment didn't come from anger across the ocean. It came from a quiet conversation inside Kensington, where Catherine would force the prince to face what this decision had truly cost him. After the files were changed and the first reactions began to ripple through the household, William stepped away from the machinery of the palace and faced the only question that mattered. What kind of king was he becoming? Catherine didn't ask him whether he was right. She asked whether he was at peace. And in that private pause, the decision stopped being political. It became deeply human. William retreated from formal meetings because the silence after authority can be louder than any argument. Formal meetings are the controlled palace discussions where aides, advisors, and officials shape decisions before they become action. The prince had spent hours surrounded by careful language, but none of it could soften what he'd done. He'd signed the order. He'd closed the active record. He'd drawn a line that Harry would feel as a wound. And now, away from court language, he had to face the cost without anyone protecting him from it. Catherine understood before he explained. She knew the decision looked like paperwork from the outside, but inside the family it was about trust. Records could be changed, invitations could be removed, briefings could be stopped, but trust once broken doesn't return because someone demands a place beside a name. She watched William carefully, not as the future king, but as a husband carrying the pain of a brother who might never forgive him. William admitted the truth quietly. He hadn't wanted to be the person who closed the door. He hadn't wanted to turn family tension into final action. But the prince couldn't leave the door half open because a half-open door had become an invitation for more pressure, more confusion, and more damage. He told Catherine that Anne had warned him in a documented private account that the monarchy would lose authority if emotional pressure was allowed to override official truth. The warning had stayed with him because it sounded harsh, but it was impossible to dismiss. Catherine reached across the table and covered William's hand. He looked down, then exhaled slowly. The prince didn't look victorious. He looked older. She reminded him that mercy without boundaries can hurt everyone else. Kindness couldn't mean letting the palace live forever inside fear. Compassion couldn't mean allowing records to pretend Meghan still held a role she no longer carried. And love for Harry couldn't mean surrendering the order his future reign would need. William looked at Catherine as if her words had stirred something inside him. She asked the question no advisor would dare ask, whether Harry would ever forgive him. The prince didn't answer quickly. He knew forgiveness might never come. He knew his brother could see this as punishment, no matter how carefully the palace explained it. Then William said the line that changed the room. Forgiveness could no longer be the measure of duty. Catherine didn't argue. She held his hand a moment longer, and in that quiet, the decision became clear in a way no document could make it. William hadn't chosen ease, he'd chosen consequence. The prince hadn't escaped pain, he'd accepted it. Meghan became a closed chapter in the working royal story, not erased from memory but removed from function. William became the man willing to end ambiguity even when the cost was personal peace. Charles became the witness to a family wound he couldn't heal, and Anne became the voice of hard truth, the one who understood that mercy without order can destroy the very crown it tries to protect. William looked toward the closed door, then turned away. The prince didn't look victorious. He looked resolved. There was no more negotiation, no hidden reversal, and no unfinished question. The record was closed, the line was drawn, and Windsor had chosen its future over its fracture. The decision was severe, it was painful, but within Windsor's walls it was treated as necessary, not revenge.